The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace sparkled under the light of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. Tonight was different from any other royal gathering. The air buzzed with nervous energy as hundreds of distinguished guests filled the ornate hall. Politicians, celebrities, and members of high society had all come to witness what many called the most important royal announcement in decades. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood at the edge of the crowd, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed down her elegant navy dress. She had chosen it carefully that morning, knowing that every detail would be scrutinized by the press and public alike. The delicate pearl earrings that had belonged to Diana caught the light as she turned her head. Scanning the room for familiar faces, William was somewhere in the crowd, preparing for his speech. As the heir to the throne, he carried the weight of tradition and expectation on his shoulders. Tonight's announcement would change everything for their family, and Catherine could feel the pressure building in her chest like a storm about to break. The palace staff moved efficiently through the crowd, serving champagne and ensuring every guest felt welcomed. Catherine recognized many faces from previous royal functions, but tonight everyone seemed more formal, more watchful. The usual light conversation and gentle laughter were replaced by hushed whispers and meaningful glances. Lady Margaret Thornfield, an elderly duchess with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, approached Catherine with measured steps. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her emerald necklace caught the light as she moved. "My dear Catherine," Lady Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of decades spent in royal circles. "You look rather pale tonight. Are you feeling quite well?" Catherine forced a smile, though her heart was racing. "I'm perfectly fine. Thank you for asking. Just a bit nervous about tonight's proceedings." Lady Margaret studied her with the intensity of someone who had witnessed countless royal dramas unfold. "Nervousness is natural, child. But remember, the crown requires strength, above all else. The people are watching, and they need to see confidence, not uncertainty." The words stung more than Catherine expected. She had always felt the weight of public scrutiny, but tonight it felt suffocating. Every smile had to be perfect, every word carefully chosen. The pressure of representing the monarchy while dealing with personal struggles was becoming overwhelming. Across the room, she spotted her brother-in-law Harry speaking quietly with his wife Meghan near one of the tall windows. They looked relaxed and happy, a stark contrast to how Catherine felt. She envied their ability to step away from the intense spotlight that followed the direct line of succession. The orchestra began playing a soft waltz, and guests started moving toward the center of the hall. Catherine knew this was her cue to find William and take her place for the formal presentation. She excused herself from Lady Margaret's watchful gaze and began walking through the crowd. As she moved through the sea of elegant gowns and tailored suits, Catherine noticed how conversations seemed to pause as she passed. People smiled and nodded respectfully, but she could see the curiosity in their eyes. Everyone knew something significant was about to be announced, but the details remained a closely guarded secret. Near the grand staircase, she encountered James Whitmore, a longtime friend of the royal family and trusted advisor. His usually cheerful demeanor seemed subdued tonight, and his greeting was more formal than usual. "Princess Catherine," he said with a slight bow, "might I say you look absolutely radiant this evening." "Thank you, James. Have you seen William recently? I believe we should take our positions soon." James glanced toward the far end of the hall, where a small stage had been prepared. "He was speaking with the Prime Minister just a few minutes ago. I believe they're discussing the final details of tonight's announcement." The mention of the announcement sent another wave of anxiety through Catherine. She had practiced her response countless times, but the reality of the moment felt far more daunting than any rehearsal. The future of the monarchy, their children's lives, and her own role in history would all be shaped by what happened in the next hour. A gentle touch on her shoulder made her turn around. It was Sarah, one of her closest friends from university, who had somehow managed to secure an invitation to tonight's exclusive event. "Kate," Sarah said quietly, using the informal name from their college days. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad. What's really going on tonight?" Catherine appreciated the familiar warmth in her friend's voice, but she couldn't reveal the true nature of the announcement. It's just another royal function, Sarah. You know how these things can be overwhelming. Sarah studied her friend's face with concern. They had known each other for over 15 years, and she could read Catherine's emotions better than most people. This isn't just another function, is it? Something big is happening tonight. Before Catherine could respond, a uniformed palace aide approached them with purposeful steps. Your Royal Highness. His Royal Highness requests your presence. It's time to begin the proceedings. Catherine nodded and said a quick goodbye to Sarah. As she walked toward the stage, her legs felt unsteady beneath her. The weight of her role, the expectations of millions of people, and the personal cost of royal duty all seemed to converge at this moment. The crowd began to quiet as William appeared on the small stage. He looked composed and regal in his formal evening wear. But Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders. They had discussed this moment countless times in private, weighing the pros and cons, considering the impact on their children and their own relationship. As Catherine joined him on the stage, the hall fell completely silent. 500 pairs of eyes focused on the royal couple, waiting for words that would shape the future of the British monarchy. The crystal chandeliers seemed to dim slightly, as if the very palace was holding its breath. William stepped forward to the microphone, his voice clear and strong as he began to speak. But as Catherine looked out at the sea of expectant faces, she felt something inside her begin to crack. The pressure, the scrutiny, the weight of duty and tradition. It all became too much to bear in that single, crystalline moment. William's voice echoed through the grand hall as he began his carefully prepared speech. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, members of the press, and dear friends of the crown. Tonight, we gather to discuss the future of our beloved monarchy and the path forward for our family. Catherine stood beside him, maintaining her composure. But inside, she felt like she was drowning. Each word William spoke seemed to push her further underwater. The announcement they were about to make would change everything: their children's futures, their privacy, and their ability to live anything resembling a normal life. For months, the Princess of Wales and I have been in deep consultation with His Majesty the King, the Prime Minister, and various constitutional experts regarding our role in the modern monarchy, William continued, his voice steady but his hands gripping the podium tightly. In the audience, Catherine could see the faces of people who had known her since she joined the royal family. Some looked supportive, others curious, and a few appeared almost predatory in their hunger for dramatic news. The weight of their collective gaze felt like a physical force pressing down on her shoulders. Lady Elizabeth Montrose, a prominent member of Parliament and longtime royal supporter, sat in the front row with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her expression was unreadable, but Catherine knew that whatever was announced tonight would be analyzed and debated in political circles for months to come. The decision we are about to share with you has not been made lightly, William said, pausing to glance at Catherine. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she saw her own struggle reflected in his gaze. It represents our commitment to serving the British people while also protecting our family's well-being. Catherine's breathing became shallow as the moment approached. She thought about their 3 children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, safe at home with their nannies, blissfully unaware that their parents were about to announce a decision that would reshape their entire lives. The innocence in their eyes when she had kissed them goodnight earlier that evening now seemed precious beyond measure. The silence in the hall was deafening. Even the staff members who usually moved discreetly through the crowd had stopped to listen. Catherine could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, almost drowning out William's words. After careful consideration and extensive discussion with all relevant parties, William said, his voice beginning to waver slightly, the Princess of Wales and I have decided to step back from our full-time royal duties and relocate our family to a private residence outside London. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Catherine watched as shock registered on hundreds of faces simultaneously. Some guests leaned forward in their seats, others began whispering urgently to their companions. The carefully maintained decorum of the royal gathering began to crack. The announcement hit Catherine like a physical blow, even though she had known it was coming. Hearing the words spoken aloud in front of all these people made it real in a way that their private discussions never had. The life she had known for over a decade was ending tonight, in this room, in front of these witnesses. Lord Frederick Ashworth, a senior member of the House of Lords, stood up abruptly from his seat, his face flushed with apparent anger or shock. "Your Royal Highness," he called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Surely you understand the implications of such a decision for the stability of the crown?" William raised his hand to quiet the growing commotion. "I understand the concerns this announcement raises, and I want to assure everyone that this decision has been made with the utmost respect for the institution of the monarchy and the British people." But Catherine could see that his words were not having the calming effect he had hoped for. The crowd was becoming restless, with some people standing and moving toward the exits while others pressed closer to the stage. The carefully orchestrated event was beginning to feel chaotic and unpredictable. Mrs. Victoria Hartwell, a prominent socialite and royal patron, stood up from her seat near the center of the room. Her voice was sharp and accusatory as she spoke. "Princess Catherine, what do you have to say about abandoning your duty to the people who have supported and welcomed you into this family?" The question cut through Catherine like a knife. She had anticipated criticism, but hearing it voiced so directly and publicly was overwhelming. The phrase, "abandoning your duty," echoed in her mind, combining with years of similar accusations and expectations that had slowly eroded her sense of self. She stepped forward to the microphone, her hands shaking visibly now. The hundreds of faces looking up at her seemed to blur together into a sea of judgment and expectation. She opened her mouth to speak the words she had practiced, the careful explanation they had crafted together about duty to family versus duty to crown. But as she looked out at the crowd, something inside her broke. The years of scrutiny, the constant pressure to be perfect, the sacrifice of her children's privacy, and the weight of representing an institution that sometimes felt more important than the people within it. It all came crashing down at once. She began, her voice barely audible through the microphone. The words she had memorized vanished from her mind completely. Instead, she saw flashes of moments that had led to this decision. Photographers following her children to school, cruel headlines about her parenting choices, the impossibility of ever having a private family moment. Tears began to form in her eyes, and she could feel them threatening to spill over. The hall had fallen silent again. But this time, the silence felt different, expectant, almost predatory. She knew that every expression on her face was being catalogued for tomorrow's headlines. She tried again, but her voice cracked. The tears she had held back for months, maybe years, finally began to fall. They rolled down her cheeks silently at first, then more freely as the emotional dam burst completely. The sight of the future queen crying publicly sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Some people looked away respectfully. Others stared in fascination. And a few members of the press in the back began frantically taking notes and photos, despite the strict no-camera policy. William moved closer to Catherine, his own composure beginning to crack as he watched his wife struggle. But before he could speak or offer comfort, something unexpected happened that would change the entire trajectory of the evening. From somewhere near the back of the hall, a voice rang out, clear and strong. It was not one of the distinguished guests or royal family members. Instead, it came from someone whose presence had gone largely unnoticed until that moment. One of the palace guards who had been standing at attention along the wall throughout the entire proceedings. The voice that cut through the tense silence belonged to Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, a decorated military veteran who had served as a palace guard for over 8 years. His deep, resonant voice carried across the hall with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "Your Royal Highness," he said, stepping slightly forward from his position along the wall. "Permission to speak, sir." Every head in the room turned toward the guard. It was unprecedented for palace staff to interrupt a royal announcement, let alone to speak without being directly addressed. The breach of protocol sent ripples of shock through the assembled crowd. But something in the guard's tone commanded attention rather than censure. William, startled by this unexpected interruption, looked toward the guard with confusion. Catherine's tears continued to flow, but she too turned to see who had spoken. The moment hung suspended between propriety and human emotion. "Sergeant Mitchell," William said slowly, recognizing the guard who had been part of their security detail for years. "This is highly irregular." "Yes, sir, it is," Thomas replied, his voice steady but filled with quiet passion. "But I've stood at attention during hundreds of royal functions, and I've never seen anything that required me to speak until tonight." The guard's words created an electric tension in the room. Lady Margaret Thornfield looked absolutely scandalized, while Lord Ashworth appeared ready to call for the man's immediate removal. But something in the guard's bearing, the respectful yet determined way he stood, the genuine concern in his voice, made even the most protocol-conscious guests hesitate. Thomas continued, his eyes moving between William and Catherine. "I've watched your Royal Highnesses serve this country with dignity and grace for years. I've seen the princess comfort grieving families after tragedies, visit sick children in hospitals during her supposed time off, and work tirelessly for causes that truly matter to the people of this nation." Catherine's tears slowed as she listened to the unexpected defender. She had noticed Sergeant Mitchell during their official functions but had never exchanged more than polite greetings with him. The fact that he had been observing their work, their genuine efforts to serve, struck her deeply. "I've also seen," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger, "how the press, and sometimes even well-meaning supporters, have forgotten that your Royal Highnesses are human beings, with hearts that can break, and spirits that can be wounded." A murmur went through the crowd. Some guests looked uncomfortable with the guard's frank assessment, while others nodded in recognition of the truth in his words. William stood frozen, unsure how to respond to this breach of protocol that somehow felt more right than anything else that had happened that evening. The script for royal announcements had never prepared him for a moment like this. Thomas took another step forward, his military bearing evident in every movement. "If I may say so, sir, watching Princess Catherine break down tonight isn't a sign of weakness or failure. It's a sign that she's human, that she cares deeply about her role and her family, and that she's been carrying a burden that would crush most people." Catherine looked at this man who had stood silently through so many public events, and she realized he had seen more than she ever knew. He had witnessed the private moments between official duties, the exhausted slump of her shoulders after particularly difficult engagements, the way she sometimes paused to collect herself before putting on her public smile. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas said, addressing Catherine directly now, "I've served this country in combat and in peace, and I've learned that true courage isn't about never showing emotion. It's about continuing to serve others, even when your own heart is breaking." The words hit Catherine like a gentle but powerful revelation. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, not caring about the makeup that might be smudged or the photographs that might capture the moment. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said, her voice stronger now though still emotional, "thank you for those words. But you should also know that stepping back from full-time royal duties doesn't mean abandoning service. It means finding a way to serve that allows us to be better parents and partners while still contributing to causes we believe in." Thomas nodded respectfully. "Of course, ma'am. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I just wanted everyone in this room to understand that what you're doing tonight, being honest about your limits and your family's needs, that takes more courage than any ceremonial duty." The guard's intervention had shifted the entire energy of the room. The hostile questions and judgmental stares were replaced by a more thoughtful silence. Even Lady Margaret looked contemplative rather than disapproving. William finally found his voice, and when he spoke, it was with a new depth of emotion. "Sergeant Mitchell, your service to this family goes far beyond your official duties, and we are grateful for your perspective tonight." Then William turned to address the crowd with renewed purpose. "My wife and I have spent years trying to balance our duty to the Crown with our responsibility as parents. We've realized that we can serve the British people more effectively if we're not constantly torn between public obligations and our children's well-being." Catherine stepped forward again, her composure restored but her vulnerability still evident. "We're not abandoning our commitment to this country or to the causes we care about. We're restructuring our lives so that we can continue to contribute meaningfully while raising our children with the stability and privacy they deserve." The explanation felt different now, more honest and human than the carefully crafted statement they had originally planned to deliver. The guards' unexpected support had given them permission to be authentic rather than simply diplomatic. Mrs. Hartwell, who had earlier spoken so critically, stood up again, but this time her voice was softer, more understanding. "Princess Catherine, I owe you an apology for my earlier words. Perhaps I, like many others, forgot that behind the titles and the duties, you're a mother trying to protect her children." Other voices began to join in, some offering support, others asking thoughtful questions about how the transition would work. The atmosphere had transformed from judgment to genuine dialogue about the future of a modern monarchy. As the evening continued, Catherine realized that Sergeant Mitchell's brave intervention had done more than defend her tears. It had reminded everyone present that royalty didn't require the sacrifice of humanity, and that true service came from authenticity rather than perfection. When the formal proceedings finally ended and guests began to file out, Catherine approached Thomas, who had returned to his position along the wall. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said quietly, "thank you for your courage tonight. Your words changed everything." Thomas stood at attention but smiled warmly. "Your Royal Highness, sometimes the most important moments require us to step outside the usual rules. I hope you and your family find the peace and happiness you're seeking." As Catherine and William left the hall together, they both knew that while their royal lives were changing dramatically, they had gained something invaluable: the knowledge that their years of service had been witnessed and appreciated by people like Thomas Mitchell, who understood that true nobility came from the heart, not from a title. The next morning's headlines would focus on the royal tears and the unprecedented intervention of a palace guard. But the real story was about a family choosing authenticity over expectation and finding unexpected support from someone who had been quietly watching and caring all along.